In this next section, we'll be talking some about how we organize the productive process that happens in the economy. After all, a lot of what we do, a significant part of most people's days, is adding to the productive capacity that we have in the economy. So we're going to take some time just focusing on the basic question of how do we organize production? How do we decide what gets produced and how? A basic overview of the kinds of things we're going to be talking about in this section. First, we'll talk about central versus entrepreneurial planning. We'll draw a distinction here and show the problems involved with attempting large-scale central planning. Then we will move into talking about the role of the entrepreneur in the modern economy and the role that profit maximization plays in guiding the use of resources. And then finally, we'll talk some about the role of the firm. That is, that we organize production not just in an individualistic way, but rather people bind together in businesses and companies in what we would call a firm in order to organize production more effectively. And we'll talk about why that happens. So first, let's talk some about central planning. Central planning, just by definition, is a system in which some central authority determines how all the resources are to be used in a particular society. Now, it might be this one authority is a dictator, it might be that the authority is some kind of central planning board where it's a number of people. They might be elected, they might not be elected. Really, you see a great variety of ways that this can be designed, but they all have the common element of the system being planned by the central authority that then would issue orders about how resources are going to be used. Now, some reasonable examples of this where we see it in probably close to the purest form. In early Soviet Russia, particularly under Lenin, we were very close to a purely centrally planned economy. Nazi Germany was actually very close as well. There was a very strong influence of the government, of the Nazi government, on how production was working. Also in modern North Korea, we see something very similar where it is a central authority that determines how resources are used for the most part within that economy. Now, in contrast, the other version is to have an entrepreneurially planned economy. Now, sometimes historically, people have talked about a centrally planned economy as just being a planned economy, and then that creates this impression that if you don't have central planning, then there is no planning at all. But we know that this is absolutely false, that in, say, the American economy, which for the most part is largely entrepreneurial, people do make plans. Instead, it happens, though, at a different level. Rather than happening mostly from a central authority, it happens from decentralized entrepreneurs. That is, different individuals, each making decisions about what to do with their own resources. Now, one point that I want to make here is that sometimes we tend to use entrepreneurs in too narrow a fashion in our normal speech. So we think of entrepreneurship as really being about going out and starting your own business. But in reality, each of us is an entrepreneur in our own sometimes very small way. For example, even though I'm an employee at a large university and I don't really run businesses on the side, I do have a certain amount of entrepreneurship that I do. I have to decide, after all, I am providing my services, who am I going to sell my services to? And it ends up I decided it made sense to enter into a long-term contractual relationship with a particular employer. At the same time, I am also somewhat entrepreneurial with the income that I receive from that. How do I use this income in order to provide well-being for myself, my family, and other people that I care about? Reasonable examples of economies that are mostly entrepreneurially planned. The United States would certainly be one of the biggest examples of that, as certainly would Canada, Western Europe. Right? Most of the Western world is largely entrepreneurially planned, though with some centrally planned elements. Japan also very largely entrepreneurially planned. South Korea is also similar in that regard, where it is a decentralized system that decides how resources are used. Now, in reality, we know that most economies really do have a combination of both. Even here in the United States, where we can say we're one of the most entrepreneurially planned economies in the world, there are still centrally planned elements. Right? There is a lot of regulation, say, that is determined by Washington, D.C., right, in this central way, and they determine there are certain uses of resources that are not allowed or that are allowed. So there are centrally planned elements, even in very entrepreneurial economies. And it often goes the other way as well. Even in very centrally planned economies, there are often pockets where there is a certain amount of freedom where individuals can decide how to use their resources. So in reality, we tend to fall between these two extremes. Now let's talk a little bit about the difficulties involved with having really large-scale central planning, where we imagine we have a very large country being planned centrally by one central authority, whether it be a central planning board or a dictator, that then tries to direct how resources are used. Now we know historically, large-scale central planning has been associated with massive economic problems. Things like poverty, starvation are very, very common in these kinds of societies. People, frankly, tend to hate living in them. They're miserable. And often this leads to people saying something like, communism is nice in theory, but doesn't work in real life. I just want to say I think that's hogwash. The reality is that if something doesn't work in real life, then the theory is lousy, right? We need to come up with a better theory to explain why we see what we actually see. Now here I think part of this comes from the fact that people kind of misuse the term theory. What theory is supposed to mean in a scientific sense is that it's an explanation for a phenomena. So that explains, well, what's my problem with this statement? Right? If something's nice in theory, that suggests the explanation makes sense. If the explanation makes sense but doesn't work in reality, there's something wrong with the theory. We need to go back. We must have done something wrong. So what we want to do here is determine, right, what kind of theory, what kind of explanation, right, will actually explain why large-scale central planning, on the whole, has tended to fail in favor of more entrepreneurially planned economies. So list 4 different problems. The first is what we call the incentive problem. Simply asking the question, how do we convince people to go along with the planner's directives? Right, the central planner, the central planning board, decides how resources are used. But how do they actually convince people to follow those decisions? Now, I would note this is not one that's particularly hard to solve. Historically, we know that Soviet Russia had a system of gulags, right? So you get sent off to Siberia if you don't follow orders, right? So in a sense, sufficiently large punishments tend to work to get people to follow at least the letter of the directives, even if not their spirit. Now, in an entrepreneurially planned economy, we have a very simple way we get around this problem, and that is that if I want you to do something for me, I just pay you enough to convince you to do what I want. Right? So, as a consumer, if I'd like you to provide me with a t-shirt, I offer you enough money that you find it worthwhile to provide me with a t-shirt. As an employer, if my employer wants me to do a particular job, they offer me enough money to where I find it worthwhile to actually show up to work and do that particular job. Right? So in the entrepreneurially planned economy, each individual has control over their own resources, but we can influence others by offering them some of the resources that we have at our disposal in order to get some of the resources that they have at their disposal. That's exactly what trade is. A second type of problem, which is much more difficult to solve, is the information problem. This was pointed out by Friedrich Hayek. What he really pointed out was something very simple, and he said that what we want for our economy to do is to match up the resources we have with the most important wants that exist in society, right? So that we are always fulfilling those wants that are most important to us. But the problem is that while conceptually the problem is very simple, in reality the information about the resources that are available and about the wants that exist are highly dispersed. Right? For example, in the United States we have over 300 million people, each of which is slightly different from the others. Right? Some people love to eat bread, some people are gluten intolerant or have celiac and they are unable to eat bread without becoming ill. Right? We have totally different wants, right? Totally different needs. The resources that are available vary depending on where you are. Right, so some acres of land are wonderful for planting crops. Some acres of land are very wonderful for, say, digging down into the ground and finding various resources we want, like coal and oil and the like. Other acres of land are pretty much only worth something if we build something on them. Right, so they're really only useful if they're developed. So we have a variety of different resources, and each area has slightly different resources. Right? This information is very spread out, right, across millions of acres and millions of people with their wants. So then, what Hayek would point out is that central planners are simply incapable of gathering all this information in a large economy. There are too many resources out there. There are too many different people with different preferences, with different wants and needs. This is a lot of data to try to gather. To make it worse, this data is constantly changing. Right? If there's a fire, a force that used to be there is no longer available, and that makes it difficult for us first to gather the data, and second to keep it updated so that we actually know what is available at this particular point in time. This is an exceptionally difficult problem. Now, the entrepreneurial solution is a division of knowledge. That is, each entrepreneur really doesn't have to worry about the system as a whole, right? Rather, we just focus on the limited set of wants and resources that are available to us. Frankly, the university really doesn't care what I spend my money on. They don't have to worry about all of my wants. All they have to worry about is whether I'm willing to work for the wage that they offer me. Similarly, I don't have to worry about all of the grocer's wants when I go and I try to buy food from them. All I have to worry about is, are they willing to accept the money that I'm giving them for the food that I would like to have? Right? So this division of knowledge, each of us focusing on just a very small part of the overall economy, right, allows us to solve this information problem. Because we don't have to worry about one central planning board or one central planner getting all of this data and keeping track of it. Each of us keeps track of the small data that is actually relevant to our own lives. A third problem is the calculation problem, which was pointed out by Ludwig von Mises. He suggests that central planning, what it really ends up doing is eliminating the markets for the factors of production. Right? If the central planning board is in fact in charge of deciding how all resources are used, there won't be any trade for different resources. Right? Because effectively they're all owned by the central planner. Now, because there's no trade, there are no prices, which makes it very difficult for us to determine what is the most efficient production method for any particular good. There are, after all, a multitude of ways that we could produce any particular good. Right? We could go, say, more labor-intensive, right? Use more people, or we could go more capital-intensive, use more machines. Something as simple as, how do you sew a shirt? Right? Do you use lots of people and just needle and thread in the fabric that they have, or do you use, say, fewer people but give them sewing machines? Which of these is better? It's not obvious unless we have some kind of common unit that we can use for calculation and comparison of these two. If we know how much we have to pay people, and we know how much we have to pay for sewing machines, then we can make the comparison. If we don't have that, it's not really clear how many people are equal to one sewing machine. So the entrepreneurial solution is really quite simple. That is, that we have cost accounting. Right? Because we have factor markets in which, say, labor and sewing machines are traded, we can see what the prices are. We can do the accounting and find out how much would it cost to produce a certain number of shirts, and then find which way is best. Right? And in fact, currency provides that common unit for comparison to happen. So we can calculate least cost methods even if the resources that we have to use with each method are very heterogeneous, that is, dissimilar from one another. And the last problem that we face with central planning is computation. This is very related especially to the information problem, but also somewhat to the calculation problem. The point here is that there's simply just too much data to process. So even if it is possible to solve Hayek's problem and get all that information in one place and keep it updated, it is actually impossible for us to take that information and process it in a way that is useful. I did some math on this and found that even if we have very simple but diverse preferences for, say, all the people on the globe, it would take the top 500 supercomputers working together longer to calculate how to just distribute 80,000 goods, let alone produce them. Even if we have just 80,000 distinct goods, if you think that's a lot, think about an average grocery store. An average grocery store has about 30,000 different unique goods that it offers. So 80,000 is not going much beyond, say, 2 different types of stores existing. So distributing 80,000 different types of goods to 6 billion different people, each of which is slightly different than the others, right? That would take more time for a supercomputer for these top 500 supercomputers combined processing power to solve than has passed since the Big Bang occurred, according to cosmologists. Naturally, this is a very significant practical problem. Now, it might be, computation gets better, but is it going to get enough better for us to actually be able to process this information in a useful way? That's a big question. Well, either way, this is, at least right now, a substantial barrier, and certainly in the past has proven to be a substantial barrier to determining how to use resources well in a centrally planned economy. Now, in an entrepreneurially planned economy, it ends up that we have a division of computation. So each business is only worried about a particular set of people, and not even worried about all their wants, just how much do they want the goods we are providing, only worried about a particular set of resources. They're only worried about information related to those that they have to process. It ends up the computation time increases exponentially with the size of the problem. So solving millions of very small problems is much, much easier and much, much more workable than trying to solve one huge problem involving all that same information. So the division of computation allows the entrepreneurially planned economy to tackle this particular problem.